Hi, church family. I hope that you've been enjoying our reading through the book of Acts. Of course, we're 7 chapters in now. Today we start chapter 8. Let me just pick up the story where we left off yesterday. Of course, Stephen was stoned to death, and Paul was there looking on, giving his approval to the entire ordeal. It was at the beginning of chapter 8 where the persecution of the church really began taking hold. And in fact, it got very hot to the extent that in verse 4, we read that the church in Jerusalem scattered and preached the word wherever they went. Now, in no way am I trying to compare the persecution of the early church to what we're going through as a church right now as well. But I did stop and see that word scattered. And I think you would agree with me that our church is definitely scattered right now. We're not able to meet at the church right now. We're meeting online. We're meeting with our families at home instead of the entire family at church. So it's definitely a different time for us. But it was the reaction of the early church that I focus on here today. When they were scattered, they weren't quiet about it. They began spreading the word and telling about Jesus wherever they went. Now, if you remember back to Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus gave us the command, "You are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Samaria until the end of the earth." But at this point, up until this point, they had just really been kind of hanging out in Jerusalem. See, what I learned here is that sometimes we have to be shaken out of our comfortable state to be able to do what God wants us to do. And I think we've got the same charge today. So many times we depend on the church when really the charge is to us as the church. It's very easy to call a friend and say, "Hey, why don't you come to church with me on Sunday?" Or to lean across the back fence and say, "Hey, we've got this great program at our church. We want you to be a part of it." But now we've actually got to take the word to our friends and neighbors who are around us, because that may be the only way they can hear. So I hear you say, "Stephen, I don't know if I can do that." Well, if that's you, let the remainder of chapter 8 being encouragement to you, where we read about a man named Philip. When Philip was scattered, he began telling everyone he met about his encounter with the Christ. In particular, in chapter 8, we learn about his encounter with Simon the sorcerer and also the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, let me put this in today's language so we can kind of understand who he's talking to. Imagine talking to a very powerful man who the entire community looks up to and adores because of what he can do, but this man is also mixed in with the occult. I can't imagine that your neighbor is any tougher to talk to than that. As far as the Ethiopian eunuch, yeah, in modern day terms, Philip talked to him on the side of the road outside his car. Surely a back fence is a little bit easier to talk to your neighbors about than meeting somebody out at their car. So I hear you say, "Stephen, I'm not a preacher. That's just not what I do." Well, let's look at who Philip was actually. If you read back in chapter 6, the disciples were having a crisis. They could not continue growing the church because they were having to focus on meeting all the needs of the people. So they chose 7 men to kind of be leaders of the church to help take care of the members of the church, to care for them. One of those people, if you remember, was Stephen, who we read about in chapter 7. Another one was Philip. You see, Philip was nobody special. He was just a guy like me and you, chosen as a leader, and knowing that his role was to tell others about his experience with Christ. You know, research tells us that most people who come to a relationship with Jesus Christ do not do so because of an encounter with a preacher or an evangelist. They do so because of a friend or a neighbor told them, and that's what led them to Christ. So my challenge to us today is this. It's not just to read Acts chapter 8, but it's to live Acts chapter 8 and to fulfill the command that Jesus gave us, to be the church and to share the gospel to the ends of the earth. Even if the ends of the earth for us right now is just the end of our driveway. I hope you have a great day.